Hello, my name is Yonatan and I will be discussing the classical issues of GDP through an article I have read for this assignment. First, the thesis of this article would be to say that the issues which are embedded within the calculation of gross domestic product, also known as GDP, originate from a misinterpretation of the value of household income, whether it be its distribution between the working and non-working person in the family, and also the way that they have disposable income. In addition, its distribution within social classes and the value of wealth, which is calculated in society, along with the negligence shown towards the benefits of inputs that have of the overall output of an economy. So, before we start, a quick refresher. What is GDP? GDP is a gross domestic product, which is a measure of the final value of all goods and services produced over a specific period of time. Which basically means that it calculates how much everything in an economy is worth when it's produced over a specific period of time. So, some common faults that GDP has, which everyone is aware of, is imputations, which, for those who do not know what it means, is basically it's an estimation of a value of a good or service based on an approximation. However, it tends to inflate GDP and is inappropriate, in my opinion, to put. GDP does not account for depreciation, which in theory harms the value of a good or service, thus does not accurately report and reflect what there is in a market when it's produced, because given a certain period of time when GDP is measured in, a good could depreciate and lose its value. In addition, it doesn't take into account for natural destruction or degradation, which, although is not a direct product of what the market produces, but can harm the process in the form of an input. And finally, it doesn't take into account income from abroad, which affects wealth and the overall income distribution in an economy. So looking at the key takeaways from this article, there's 3 or 4 which I want to focus on, divided into different slides. First of all is, as I previously mentioned, there's this inability from the GDP measurement to calculate inputs, thus meaning that it cannot estimate how much an input may impact an economy, right? And there's 2 types of inputs. There's collective, which would be something like national security, an army, being able to invest in the army for there to be safety of trade, or being able to do a trade barrier or something of such sort. Or, for example, another example would be a defensive expenditure, which would be environmental investment, whether it be into a forest or preservation of a certain natural resource of such sorts. And then you have private input, which is healthcare and education, which is what most people acknowledge as such an important value of input. And as you can see in this graph here, this was taken from the document, and it compares the non-healthcare services, the non-market health services in Denmark and how big the volume of the impact would actually be versus the input and the output. Looking forward, right, in the first year or so, the difference is quite equal, I would say. But passing 2002, the increase in the potential of the output versus the input is much larger, showing that if the GDP would take care and calculate input properly, it would be able to really maximize and inflate the GDP's value, because the input, although is a non-direct growth impacting element in the development of the volume and the output, it is crucial. And this is something which is important, which I personally wish that could change, because it would really affect a lot of the GDP ratings of different countries around the world, because you'll be able to see how some are investing now but may seem a bit less powerful or economically strong due to a low GDP, but with the progress they're taking, they would be able, such as Denmark, they would be able to reach a far higher GDP due to the higher level of education or healthcare, or just overall higher standards of living. And a second takeaway is, the value of wealth is not determined accurately through GDP. This is something which was very importantly depicted in the article. It shows that wealth can be determined basically of how much money and objects you have of value, right? But wealth, in my opinion, should be determined with a combination of income and expenditure per household. And as obvious as it may seem, some people may think that just because one is rich financially and has a lot of money, is not someone that is rich, right? But if they do not spend that money, they do not have any expenditure, which does not reflect their wealth. Thus, you need to be able to balance both elements. In addition, the article highlighted the fact that some expenditure within households is differentiated based on how people are in the house. Whether, let's say, for example, the wife of the pair is working and the husband is a stay-at-home dad, and he does not work. However, he takes care of all the things around the house, cutting costs for the wife in this case, which is working a full-time job. However, she brings in income, but by doing so and having a mixed balance between the two, they're able to progressively work together and bring in the highest income and minimize expenditure. Also, I think GDP should be recalculated using this new format of wealth appreciation, because a lot of times it's taken through averages and medians, which show inaccurate data respective to the whole economic output, whilst you may have a lot of upper 5% people and citizens, which might raise the average but does not accurately reflect how the wealth of the country is. In some countries, such as Kazakhstan, for example, which is extremely wealthy in natural resources, but 80% of the population is extremely poor, and only the top 20% has more than what we would call average in Europe. And as you can see here in the graph, figure 1.5, we have France and the United States, where they compare the average income per capita and average consumption in the straight lines, right, which are quite similar to one another. However, based on surveys conducted in France, their average consumption and median are much lower, meaning that these data are not false but inaccurate due to these high averages given. Whilst in the United States, because people are overall much more wealthy, you can see that the lines are quite similar, yet they're still quite deferred around the year of 2000, where the economy started to grow and develop. Moving on. Another key takeaway is the benefits of non-market investment and expenditure. What does that mean? Basically, it's what it sounds like. It's an investment in healthcare and education, improving the standards of living, the life expectancy, the overall intelligence and skill of the workforce, and the overall ability for society to be productive. And then this would allow the government to be able to provide the workforce with better workers, in the case of Sweden, for example, where education is public. And as you can see, through the 90s, they've invested substantial amounts of money and capital into the educational system. And through the mid-2000s and the late 10s, they were peaking, increasing the volume and the output of what they've been able to achieve. Thus, showing that the investment in non-market, which would be the people, allows a country to increase its GDP. Although it's not an immediate effect, in the long run it allows it to become a much more productive and much bigger economic force. And the last key takeaway, which I thought was key from this article, was the fact that GDP does not represent the distribution of income across society. Here is an example where we're looking at China and France. Again, China is known to be, in recent years, quite a wealthy country. As you can see, the bottom 50% of China is represented with the black line and the black triangles, showing that over the years, as China has become a much more potent economic country, the percentage of wealth has been divided with the lower percent is being reduced, as the higher top percent have become so wealthy that they can cover a lot of the GDP and the overall income of the country. Whilst, as you can see, the line with the black squares shows the opposite. As China has modernized and come out of communism, it was able to become more and more powerful, and they've gained more money, the top 1%, becoming more and more capitalist. However, France shows some sort of trend which is consistent with what you would expect from a European country, where there is a strong middle class, as the top 50%, the bottom 50% has about 22 to 23% of the overall income, whilst the bottom 1% shows only 8 to 10%. And as a consequence, the GDP does not really reflect that, and it shows only the wealth as a whole. However, in my opinion, a poor income distribution and a big wealth gap is a very poor indicator of a very over-capitalistic country, and thus not showing the correct abilities of what the country actually is when most people are quite poor. Now, my main critique of this article is the way they have introduced the value of imputed goods, which once again, I will remind you, is goods that have been overestimated in value and been put into the GDP in order to inflate it a little bit, which a lot of countries tend to do that because they're goods which are hard to estimate their value, such as healthcare. How do you estimate that? Or even education. It could be anything from a highway system or anything that is not tangible monetarily. Yes, you can count the cost of goods of a highway, but this is not something which you can value. Nonetheless, it is not solid enough evidence of growth, especially if they don't take into account the input values of such things like investment in education and stuff, which I think is kind of the missed point in this article. And finally, my core question towards the article and what I've learned is to what extent would the value of the GDP of countries around the world would change if the criteria such as the value of non-economic activity inputs, correct wealth assessments, and reevaluation of income distribution were valued properly. And this leads me to think that obviously some countries, such as the Nordic countries, which now are investing a lot into the future generations, would have a much higher GDP, while some countries, like the United States, which, although they spend tons of money into their health system, you would see that the difference between them will not be as similar as you think because of obvious reasons and how expensive the healthcare is in the United States, for example, or a good education, how difficult it is to find for relatively cheap. And here are my sources in case you're interested, and thank you very much.